Even before the invasion of the whole nation ensued, in just this one small corner of the larger invasion as a whole, an AO, or Area of Operations, given over to the People's Armed Police for responsibility, its 4th Corps belonging to its 2nd Mobile Contingent, a much larger parent element from within the PAP. The forces in this area of People's Armed Police had since gathered their strike power for this invasion in this once very sleepy section of Webb County, Texas. The town of Dolores, originally having had been founded as a coal mining town, as there were limited coal mining deposits within the area that has since been exhausted, it had gone through its boom and bust life cycle and was now experiencing somewhat of a boom. This due to several factors. There had been originally only a small tourism industry in the 90s and earlier, but had since grown drastically in population. This was due to foreign investments from Mexico, the large multinational corporation that specialized in building materials and originally was just a cement company and now is one of the largest of its type, had invested heavily in the once abandoned industrial park within the Dolores town and its southeastern boundary area. It was to revitalize a once coal mining affiliated area with a coal mining and coal storage facility and turn it into an area wherein cement would be produced and shipped off to market, along with the revitalizing of its International Commerce Center, once only a tourist relic, had now been since transformed in the previous 3 decades into a true international commerce center, as offices before the invasion had been established within this area and a true chamber of commerce for the town itself. The whole area in and around Dolores had a population of approximately 15,000 total inhabitants, which had been growing not only due to the previous immigration crises as homes were being occupied and filled in the town and newer homes were being built to accommodate the investments into the town, but there were also an ample amount of ranchers and farmers who had previously lived within this larger corner of Webb County. As a proper census had not really been truly taken of this area since the early 90s, much of its growth had been discounted, and it is still a misconception that it is a ghost town, although the smaller village of Ranchas Penitas West was still relatively small and had under 1,000 people as its population. But due to being located miles from I-35 and thereby having access to the city of Loredo and the border and routes inland, the town of Dolores was not only strategic from a business standpoint, but was strategic as well from a military standpoint, as the paramilitary or parallel military forces of the People's Armed Police were tasked with clearing this northern flank of the invasion prong of the 7th through 13th Group Armies of any and all armed resistance in this area, as I-35 was in very close proximity and since international hostilities, the numbers of border and also customs personnel had since grown in this area, with new administrative areas and motor pools and other related facilities had been constructed inside and around the Dolores area especially. The first of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a battalion that belonged to the overall 72nd Infantry Brigade combat team, most of which was deployed further to the south in the Loredo Battle space, which itself was part of the larger 36th Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard, was likewise in this area to assist and support border security operations, not only due to previous failed border policies, but also because of the international tensions, which at this point in time were about to boil over into full-out invasion and war, the largest invasion in human history. As the 4th Artillery Regiment and its 3 firing battalions, each firing battalion possessing 7 batteries and 1 headquarters and support company, each began to fire their howitzers in support of the now crossing ground troops at midnight, having crossed upon the American military satellites, having been eliminated by the first volleys of both Chinese and Russian anti-satellite weapons. The Americans had lost their ISR capabilities. Also, in addition to this, the Americans had lost their drone capabilities, as had also occurred over 180 miles to the south of this map in the McAllen Lower Rio Grande area, as the 111th Attack Wing, a prominent fixture in the Texas Air National Guard, consisting of MQ-9 Reaper drones, had utterly been smashed, as these long-range drones constituted one aspect of the American ISR capabilities, at least within this more broad region of operations. They've also lost their spy planes as well, at least in the form of the RC-3B aircraft. The Q-5s, having since crossed into American airspace at midnight, already had began to strike targets deeper inland, while the PAP's own artillery forces began to lob shells at all targets that were within the range of its firing batteries sitting across the Rio Grande within Mexico, many of which being right across on the western side of Mexican Highway 2. This area being a mix of largely desert, but also areas of prime ranching land with tall grasses and alluvial grasses along the river itself, the Rio Grande. The town of Dolores was by this point, mere minutes into the invasion, already under siege, as 3 whole battalions of the 5th Medium Brigade of the People's Armed Police rushed to not only cordon the town at its outer edges, but completely sweep the town of any and all resistance, as Chi-Com intelligence ascertained, and correctly, that there were just over 1,000 armed civilians within this area who themselves had heavily armed themselves due to criminal elements had taken advantage of previous failures at the border, and thus themselves were certainly in no mood to deal with any such not just criminal elements, but any type of foreign entities or invaders in the sense of the word. And although the PAP was a brutally fanatical element of the Chi-Com security forces as a whole, they would find that although at a severe disadvantage in terms of weapons and actionable intelligence, the Americans nonetheless would still put up a fairly tough fight, all circumstances considered, that were levied against them. As well as these 1,000 armed civilian defenders located at different points throughout this town and in its immediate vicinity, was also just over 300 American paramilitary forces guarding the actual border area of the town itself within the town limits at a bridge spanning the border. These 350 approximately American paramilitary forces consisted not only of border paramilitary forces of that agency, but also of customs forces of that agency as well, which themselves, pertaining to the latter, had been relocated to the area as the area began to grow in terms of its commerce and foreign investment into the area, thus being a requirement that it be sent in order to adequately police the area in terms of the volume of trade that was now an investment that was now just beginning to occur there. As it had been stated mere minutes into the invasion, border areas were quickly overwhelmed, with the crossing areas and bridges being captured nearly completely intact. The bridges were intact, but the areas adjacent to them were victims of relatively light fire in terms of the volume of fire meted out, although the forces occupying the area of the Route 1, Mexican Route 1 / 255 route border crossing area were mostly completely destroyed, with very few survivors escaping to run into Dolores itself to inform the people there of what was going on, as there were no communications by this point, and America had lost its intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, and not only the form of its satellites to the anti-satellite attack, but also its spy aircraft and drones, constituting its own ISR capabilities. As these forces crossed in mere minutes and proceeded to surround the town before attempting to clear it, the one forward deployed company of the 1st of the 141st Battalion, some 120 men, had already been sent into the town of Dolores to reinforce the border paramilitary elements that were actually patrolling and policing this particular border area, in addition to the customs paramilitary forces that were there with them. This forward deployed company, having had been sent into the town just prior to the invasion, was now being targeted by the PAP's own artillery forces, its firing batteries of each of its 3 battalions of its 4th PAP Artillery Regiment. Primarily the main battalion levying the most firepower upon it, however, was the northernmost 122 millimeter Type 83 howitzer battery, not to be confused with the other Chinese Type 83 howitzer, which was a self-propelled 152 millimeter heavy howitzer. These lighter towed pieces were not self-propelled like the 152, but were passed down largely to reserve units of the PLA, as well as to paramilitary elements like the People's Armed Police for their use. In addition to which was also the Type 59-I or -1, as if this was a Roman numeral type of artillery piece, which was a 130 millimeter artillery piece, which was larger and more destructive than the 122 millimeter lighter pieces were, which there was one whole battalion of 7 firing batteries and a headquarters and support battery within the 4th PAP Field Artillery Regiment, which were a 130 millimeter battalion as a whole. The other 2 battalions being 122 millimeter Type 83 battalions, such as this battery from 1 battalion shown at their firing positions, laying down heavy firepower upon their sector of the invasion. As 3 different battalions prepared to advance upon the town to surround and clear it of any and all enemy resistance, and the heavy firepower from its artillery prepared the way for it, one whole battalion of light tank forces was to literally sweep the whole southern end of town, while another full battalion cordoned and spread out along the southernmost boundaries of the town. All the while, the same Mechanized Infantry Battalion, a separate battalion from these 2 light tank battalions, had since already overrun and cleared the border post and 2 adjacent border facilities within a 3 by 3 kilometer area here right across the border, and had since moved upon Dolores in their part of the assault upon this now medium-sized town by advancing upon clusters of armed civilians, having since been spotted by their reconnaissance and intelligence obtaining assets, namely in the form of drones, with one hovering CH-4A armed reconnaissance drone monitoring this larger area, but also from platoon-based drones operated by the PAP units on the ground themselves, the different companies, each having several platoon-based drones per company, corresponding to each platoon of each company, monitoring the area and relaying back targeting data for close-in air support from the Q-5 aircraft, also patrolling the area, as well as their own artillery, at least anything within range of the artillery itself. Anything not within immediate range of their artillery before they were to pack up and change firing positions would thus be relayed to their Q-5s for close air support ground strikes in support of the ground troops. To the north, the 7th PAP Brigade, a regular mechanized infantry brigade with no light tanks of any sort or tracked vehicles, a WZ-551 oriented brigade, was only starting to break out of their CCP properties and prepare to convoy into the area from further north, fairly close to the Eagle Pass area, where CCP properties had been strategically purchased by the CCP regime many years prior to set up for this very moment of the invasion. As the invasion was underway, the 4 other battalions of the 5th Medium Brigade, which itself, this 5th Medium Brigade, belonged to the 4th PAP Corps, which itself belonged to the much larger 2nd Mobile Contingent of the People's Armed Police. The 4th PAP Artillery Regiment was also a part of the 4th PAP Corps, which itself was part of the 2nd Mobile Contingent, as was the 7th PAP Regular Brigade. This PAP Medium Brigade itself, a medium brigade due to the fact that it had 2 light tank battalions, in addition to its mechanized infantry battalions, of which it had 4, its headquarters battalion, and a separate support battalion, although the headquarters battalion itself, of course, contained support units within its battalion. So in a sense, there were 2 logistical/support battalions of this medium brigade, the 5th Medium Brigade of the People's Armed Police. In the first 30 minutes of the battle alone, the town was heavily shelled in the south by artillery and just beginning to be hit in the north by Q-5 ground attack aircraft, with 4 of the Squadron's 12 available aircraft for just this one battle space, patrolling the area and looping the area so that the ground forces could call the orbiting aircraft to conduct ground strikes whenever and wherever necessary as it pertained to the armed civilians who were now attempting the best way they could to put up a resistance. Although many were slaughtered in so doing, they put in a great effort and actually managed to even destroy 2 of the PAP's light tanks with Molotov weapons, while 2 additional vehicles were lost, one being an armored personnel carrier and another being another light tank of a separate battalion, the one cordoning the south of the city, by tow missiles that were fired by the forward deployed 1st of the 141st, one of their companies, as mentioned, one of their mechanized infantry companies, which was sent closer to the border from their campsite, which was further to the northeast, in order to support the paramilitary border security forces, although the loss of communications made their ability to respond exceedingly difficult, as was also the case with the armed civilians and the paramilitary defending forces all combined together. All in all, there were 1,400 defenders just within the city, or the small town of Dolores itself, trying to put up the best fight, best resistance they could against the now invading PAP forces as they rolled rapidly inland. Within 30 minutes already beginning their outer cordon of the town with their light tank companies belonging to 1 light tank battalion, 4 of which, along with their 3 armored infantry companies with their headquarters company, sitting further back and closer to the border, while in the middle of the town itself, the other light tank battalion, being spearheaded by 2 of its light tank companies, were busy clearing the center of the town closer to the Route 255 thoroughfare, which practically bisected the town. This blue line being the town's outer limits, the town limits, and in the north, the town had a field along with newer homes, but also older homes that were ranch properties of ranchers that lived in the area initially, before the area began to see a population expansion. In the northern part of the town, companies belonging to the 1 Mechanized Infantry Battalion that already overran the border were busy surrounding and destroying armed civilian pockets at first in a residential part of the town on its outer edges, before proceeding onward to cordon the northern end of the town in its international commerce center. This mini-map, this one segment of this larger Battle of Dolores town, is a 2-by-2 mile area, a segment of the town. And at the opening of the battle, artillery was smashing this area, this residential area of the southern part of the town here, and in the north, Q-5 aircraft were conducting ground attack strikes here, using at first 500-pound munitions, at least for the aircraft that were originally on their first sortie assigned to support the troops in this area, due to the fact that their ground troops would be operating in relatively close proximity to their close air support missions, thus foregoing the use of larger 1,000-pound munitions, which caused drastically more destructive radiuses. Not that the 500-pounders weren't highly destructive, but they were nowhere near as potent as the 1,000-pound munitions that could also be carried by these Q-5 strike aircraft, 4 apiece. As the forces advanced through the middle of the town, crossing a small field between the border and the town limits in this area, as shown right here. The artillery, slightly to their south, 122 millimeter, was pounding this area, hitting targets belonging to the one American Mechanized Infantry Company, having had been sent to the area from the 1st of the 141st Battalion, its specific parent unit, with the other companies belonging to the battalion still at their campsite at the time of the invasion, slightly to the northeast of town, approximately some 18 miles away at the time of the initiation of hostilities. This separate one company was already not just being attacked by the 122 millimeter artillery being fired from the PAP 4th Artillery Regiment's firing positions within Mexico, miles away, but was also being hit by CH-901 loitering munitions that themselves had been fired by the drone sections from within the 5th Medium PAP Brigade's headquarters battalion right here, firing a volley of 48 CH-901A loitering munitions to begin the operation with, all of which being armed with heat or high explosive anti-tank warheads, circling the area on their artificial intelligence-based targeting, looking for specific targets, priority targets being Bradley IFVs, which there were several of that belonged to this company, with lower priority targets being M113 APCs and MRAPs, which also likewise belong to the company, with Bradleys out of all three vehicle types being given the highest priority, as these infantry fighting vehicles had the ability to fire tow systems from their turrets, their turret-based tow pods to a piece, or their 20mm autocannon, which itself could become very destructive to lighter vehicles like the PAP's headquarters vehicles, or to its dismounted infantry forces now beginning to operate in the town, some of which having had been dismounted in the fields immediately adjacent to the town, a few hundred meters out, to provide infantry support to the heavier vehicles, such as their light tanks, their Type 62G light tanks, which, unlike the original Type 62, had a much more advanced fire control system, whereas the original vehicle had none. This being an upgrade from the original Marconi-based Chinese copy of a Marconi fire control system, which was its second iteration of fire control system before the vehicle had begun to be passed down to second and third tier units of the large PLA ready reserve of group armies, often operated by light units such as mountain units or even airborne units in some cases, or paramilitary forces like the PAP. As the Type 15 light tank, which was a brand new light tank, was beginning to be heavily proliferated among the ranks of the PLA's main forces, as these light tanks were ideal for operating in either jungle environments, heavily wooded environments, in the Tibetan Plateau environment, and other such environments where a main battle tank was just too heavy or impractical. But these Type 62Gs, which the G meant Gai in Chinese or improved, were very modernized versions of the original, with the original bubble top turret being completely disposed of with a much more better put together welded armored turret, which from certain views, especially a side view, resembled very much the American M60 battle tank of Gulf War fame, which itself was famous in use of the Marine Corps and having destroyed many Iraqi vehicles. This PLA, or former PLA active tank, which was now only operated by PLA Reserve Forces or lighter PLA Reserve Forces, or the PAP, likewise boasted a 105 millimeter main gun similar to the American M60's original iteration, boasting a 105 millimeter light gun. This one in particular being a more advanced British L7 copy, as this was an older tank, and at the time when these tanks were being upgraded decades ago, a Chinese version of the L7, which was elongated and thus given much higher muzzle velocity and range, was a vast improvement over the original L7 gun copy. This gun had a range of approximately 4 kilometers and could really reach out and devastate enemy targets, as it was capable of firing ATGMs from its bore, as it was designed to do such, as well as fire depleted uranium rounds, sabot ammunition, and standard heat ammunition, or high explosive anti-tank, as well as frag-T shells, or these fragmentation shells, which were ideal against enemy bunkers or concentrations of troops, making these vehicles very devastating against various different types of targets. Since the PAP was a paramilitary force and typically operated lighter armored vehicles for the most part, such as many wheeled armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, these light tanks were also operated by its medium units, which themselves comprised of these light tank companies, as well as tracked armored infantry companies, which themselves wielded a Type 86 infantry fighting vehicle, which was likewise passed down from the PLA to the PAP, which was a very modernized, upgraded iteration of the original, being the A series, as well as the Type 63 APCs, which themselves were so numerous, they were found all throughout the PLA and also in these PAP units of their armored infantry that were part of their light tank battalions as well. Although their Mechanized Infantry Battalion was strictly wheel-based, APC and IFV versions of the WZ-551 likewise produced in enormous quantities and found in PLA lighter units as well as PAP, paramilitary formations. During the fighting in the town, the Guard company in the area of the National Guard from the 1st of the 141st Infantry Regiment, itself belonging to the 72nd IBCT, or Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which itself was part of the 36th ID, was quickly being picked apart, with many of its vehicles destroyed within minutes, although by this point, fortunately for them, many of their troops had thus since dismounted and were now scattered throughout the battlefield, and due to loss of communications, were left to their own devices, as the leaders of these various squads sought to use their men as a guerrilla-style fighting force, in addition to the armed civilians which were fighting in the same manner. There were very few paramilitary elements of the border forces that were originally at the border by the time of this battle erupting, but what little bits of them remained that managed to flee to fight on were likewise scattered amongst the defenders within this town, with the very few survivors that did flee the border on time running into the town to yell and scream about what was going on, to warn the people, as if the artillery strikes were already not enough, that a full-scale invasion was underway, and enemy forces were crossing in strength, as at the time, even the border forces didn't exactly know who their enemy exactly was, as they didn't have very strong night vision capabilities, minus a few systems that had been given to them as they proliferated through the American military and into paramilitary agencies, as these agencies were mostly there for guarding the border and not as a military unit that was designed to fight in all weather and day or night. Although they did have some, as their mission mandated them to, but not every one of them had a pair of NVGs. So they couldn't exactly tell who their enemy was. All they could tell was that they were taking fire from across the Rio Grande, and they had to get out of the way, as to stay there would mean certain death. As the mechanized infantry forces moved in, this platoon here began to set up a cordon, while another 2 platoons of this one mechanized infantry company moved to cordon the southern part of this small neighborhood just to the north of 255, the main thoroughfare through town, while yet more forces, these being dismounted mechanized infantry from this platoon here, raced around to cordon the northern parts while they called in a close air support mission, a Q-5 that had already dropped a few of its 500-pound munitions a bit further back in another neighborhood in this small town, to come in and flatten this grid of homes here. As by this point, there were ample armed civilians running to and fro in the area, as this was so early on in the initial invasion that confusion and panic was everywhere. And although these armed civilians were certainly armed and ready and capable of taking on armed criminal elements, which was the initial reason why these civilians made sure to heavily arm themselves and become familiar with their own personal weapons platforms that they operated, meaning their rifles and other such implements, they were not quite ready to take on a determined, well-armed and equipped and motivated invader, such as the Chi-Coms and their various military and paramilitary elements, like the PAP being one of its multiple paramilitary branches, as there were other paramilitary elements within the massive Chinese paramilitary arm of its security forces. Although the PAP was the most fanatical and most well-armed of these paramilitary forces, being equipped like a military unit, as opposed to a gendarmerie force found in many other nations. CH-901As launched from the original volley of 48 fired by the headquarters battalion's drone sections of the 5th Medium Brigade likewise flew further into the town and hit these armed civilian and military forces with their MRAPs from this headquarters platoon from the original mechanized infantry companies forward deployed into the town, who were attempting themselves to set up an ambush in the area, although they were spotted first by the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets of the PAP forces now surrounding and clearing the town, and were thus destroyed by these CH-901s armed with heat warheads. All CH-901s by this point being the A version of the CH-901, able to loiter for a longer amount of time over the battlefield, also given a longer range. In the south, one whole battalion, being one whole light tank battalion, was cordoning the southernmost areas of the town, with its objective to bend around the town and link up with the mechanized infantry forces coming down from the north, while another whole battalion was sent through the town itself. Although most of the fighting was occurring inside the town between the American military, the very few paramilitary in the area, and mostly armed civilians, there was a lot of fighting going on the southern edges of the town itself. This being the town's small industrial area right here, consisting of a few brand new textile plants which were producing shirts and other clothing, along with the once coal storage plant here, which was utilized during the coal era of the town's history, now having had been converted for use by the CEMEX International Building Material Corporation, likewise using these other facilities within the periphery of it as offices and administrative areas, which were now a strong point of American guerrilla fighters among the civilians who were trying to put up a resistance against the armored infantry companies and light tank companies who were now proceeding around the south of the town to head north and link up with elements of these mechanized infantry forces that were going in and clearing the north, including the International Commerce Center, which was now, once again, before the invasion, a true international commerce center with all the foreign investment, and there being a chamber of commerce that was actually flourishing for the town at this point before the invasion, although recent economic troubles did curtail certain economic activity. Due to the foreign investment, this town was still experiencing growth right before the invasion, as again, a proper census hadn't even been taken of the town since the early 90s. Just outside of the town, there were a few older farms and ranches that had been there ever since the early founding of the town, where armed civilians tried to take cover, as this building here, this ranch home, had been destroyed. There's its barn. There's another ranch home and barn here. This was the industrial zone of the town on the outermost corner of it. Textile buildings here for the textile plant. And the rest of it was mostly neighborhoods of original buildings and newer buildings. Here were some farms and ranches to the northwest of the town, near its northern portion and southern portions town limits here, as the 255 route state highway was like a thoroughfare when it went through the town. It bisected the town between its northern and southern areas. And to the northwest was mostly a residential area as well, with slightly more off this map, and this being its commerce center within this corner, and some apartments, some new apartment buildings, as well as a gas station and another gas station and small business area adjacent of stores and such in the small downtown area here, adjacent to the small industrial park that was now being revitalized for the past 20 years. As the forces in the north moved and cordoned and swept areas that had recently been struck and razed to the ground and flattened by close air support strikes, eliminating many dozens of armed civilians in the area, these forces that cordoned the south of this neighborhood here were likewise had some of their gunners orienting their fire into this area to support one of their dismounted squads, who was also supporting this side, the right flank of their advancing 2 platoons worth of vehicles here that were moving to cordon the south of this neighborhood when it was flattened. Other dismounted forces in their wedge formations had since cleared this area of small homes and ranch areas outside of the town, and were thus moving in wedge formation or double column formation into this area, with this one squad going through the area once the close air support had destroyed this neighborhood to clear the area and make sure that by some miracle there weren't any survivors within it, as the squad would spread up into 2 stack team-like elements that would proceed through the rubble-strewn streets looking for any survivors. By this point, The vicious nature of the People's Armed Police was now apparent to everybody as the PAP fired at everything that moved and didn't distinguish between armed and unarmed civilians, as the PAP was a brutal force and was hell-bent on destroying anything that they saw. The main combat elements of the one American company deployed had since been, by this point, destroyed within mere minutes of the opening artillery barrage in the southern part of the town, as also close air support missions were to be flown in as well, in addition to the CH-901 loitering munitions hitting their vehicles with heat warheads, destroying many of them instantaneously, eliminating the driver, the TC, and gunners on all the vehicles that were hit where applicable. But the infantry that were assigned to each of their own vehicles had since been dismounted and were fighting in the streets, but many of them had likewise been destroyed by artillery strikes from 122mm artillery, which had flattened many of these buildings as shown as they are rubble in this picture here. Rubbled buildings with armed civilians here had been eliminated by other tanks of this battalion moving through this field here. And yet others were destroyed here, with this Bradley having blocked the street here in an attempt to fight back, in which they did hit and destroy a PAP light tank, a Type 62G with a tow system, before themselves being fired at by the tank behind it with its 105mm rifled tank gun from over half a mile away. The main problem was not that they couldn't see the Americans, but that upon moving into this area, the artillery strikes and all of the other additional movements of their own troops made the firing against these forces here a bit slower, because they didn't want any friendly fire incidents as various forces were maneuvering through the area adjacent to them and possibly to come up on side of them, as they were also focused on destroying this area and these forces down here, giving them just enough time to fire one of their two tow missiles, thereby destroying the lead tank on the right side of the column, but the other tank behind it was able to lock onto this vehicle after engaging another vehicle and destroy it in return. As often occurs in warfare, even when one side has overwhelming advantages, that doesn't mean that they don't suffer any loss. As so many different things occur in battles, a wide range of activities have to be perfectly coordinated and quickly. And although the artificial intelligence that the Chi-Coms had access to allowed them to become ever more flexible and faster responding to occurring activities on the battlefield, this didn't mean that they still couldn't suffer losses at the hands of certain weapons when within a certain proximity of them. Although their losses, however, would be extremely light regardless, but occasionally still they would suffer losses, such as losing this one light tank here to this Bradley firing its tow system, one of two of them. As that had occurred, recovery assets from within this company, within this one tank company of the 4 different tank companies, 3 armored infantry companies, and headquarters company that comprised this one armored battalion, light tank battalion coming up through the center here, would come and retrieve the burning hulk of the destroyed tank, which was now sitting there smoking due to being hit by the tow, and with small fires breaking out in it, in what remained of it. They would come, extinguish, and haul away the destroyed tank while the other armored vehicles were proceeding around to continue on their mission, firing at anything that moved, damaging buildings or outright destroying them, such as here, here, and here, such as this building, this rubble, where these armed civilians had originally been taking cover from behind a full building, but it was hit by tank shells and leveled along with their being eliminated, along with them now bending and moving up this way, as these armed troops, again, as I said earlier, that there were troops from their armored infantry moving around them to give them support, and it all had to be coordinated, and it was being coordinated exceedingly quickly due to the artificial intelligence, the quick command making, due to the AI streamlining all the fluid battlefield data, and the commanders making quick decisions in response. All of this was being coordinated exceedingly fast, happening in mere minutes. Although, again, with so many things going on the field of battle, all of this had to be orchestrated and coordinated as best as conceivably possible, as effectively as possible. So therefore, these forces moved ahead to provide infantry support as these armored forces, this column, this one tank company and its lead vehicles, now proceeded around, having already had destroyed this small business here in this little gas station plaza due to them taking fire from it. They destroyed this small business building, which was basically two small businesses connected. They destroyed this building and then sent one platoon of 5 light tanks to block this gas station in, traveling along the 255 thoroughfare, with their other 3 combat platoons of light tanks spreading out and cordoning the southern part of the gas station, all taking fire from the armed civilians, although levying heavy fire back in return in the form of their coax 7.62 by 54 millimeter machine guns, which were connected to the main gun, essentially, for all intents and purposes, which were right beside the main gun, and as well as heavy machine gun fire from the 12.7 millimeter turret gunners who sat in the tank turret firing the 12.7 millimeter machine guns down at the armed civilians in this area, all being careful to vector their firepower cautiously so as not to be causing any friendly fire incidents, as this was a relatively small area, and the tank guns had to generally lower their turrets roughly 10 degrees to be able to fire down and into the groups of armed American civilians, along with the heavy machine gunners on the turrets, pointing their turret guns down at the armed civilians and taking great care to aim and make sure that they fired only at the armed civilians and didn't raise their heavy machine guns too high to where they could accidentally hit their own forces. And all of this was, of course, assisted by the reconnaissance drones and specially given commands, and all being streamlined by AI as battlefield conditions changed, and more, and their commanders and their NCOs taking charge and acting efficiently over their vehicles and crews and squads. This group of small businesses was also destroyed, as there were armed civilians clustering around it, trying to sit on top of it and fire down at the enemies, and also from within it. It was attempting to be used as a strong point, but was heavily shelled by tank fire before this company here on foot moved in and around it to support another company who was moving through and clearing these buildings en route to the Commerce Center, another of these dismounted companies, this one right here. Or is this one right here. There's a lot going on these maps, all happening at the same time. So trying to present this coherently is difficult, but so far these National Guard forces and some armed civilians intermingled with them have been heavily shelled and destroyed when the southern end of town was shelled in the opening phases of the battle with one whole battalion moving through the industrial zone and firing at any ambushing forces hiding in and between the factories themselves, having smashed through this chain link fence and into the former coal storage area, which was being converted into a cement plant under CMAX before the invasion, with their armored infantry in tow to provide them armored infantry support. Although the ambushing Americans using guerrilla-style tactics did fight exceedingly hard and wounded a few of the PAP troops, so far there were no KIAs by this point in the battle of this prong here. But they were about to lose 2 tanks to Molotov cocktails a bit further off the map, as one of the subordinate companies of the battalion was moving up to take its spot on the far outer cordon of the northeasternmost part of town by about the time they almost reached 255 further up here, but a bit off the map in this segment of the larger battle. As all of this was occurring, and another company moved up through the industrial area right here within the town and slightly from outside of it in this area of older ranches, and they were occupied by clusters of armed civilians, this being one of the original ranches and this one being another, which was leveled to the ground by tank shells. This one being fired at, as there was a large group of armed civilians here, and there were brand new homes built both along 255 across the thoroughfare from the commerce area and some newer homes here. It was a mix of newer and older buildings, essentially, was what this town was before the invasion. So by the time all of that was occurring, pictured here, we have in the northern edges of town the mix of residential areas, as you can see in the background, are homes and smaller buildings, including up on the hill right outside of the town, off the map up here. And in town, there are some 3-story structures which were being used as apartment buildings and such, or smaller businesses. There was already savage fighting in this area, with the CHI-COM Mechanized Infantry forces diligently moving through the town and firing at anything that moved, as these were far more brutal than the PLA, who often ignored unarmed civilians due to trying to follow their own version of the Geneva Conventions and Humanitarian-Law. The PAP did not care whatsoever at all about this and were far more brutal and fired at anything they saw moving. But of course, they gave the highest priority to the armed resisting forces, whether they be Guard or paramilitary, American paramilitary or civilians. But anyone unarmed, they also eliminated, such as was the case right on this street corner here. They peppered this building with heavy fire, called in their close air support, which 2 Q5s were already pummeling this hill here and this hill here, with 2 more swooping down, dropping 2 1,000-pound munitions before both having had turned like this to fly off and out of the area. Over here, there were exchanges of small arms and even some grenades thrown between these PAP forces of this half of a squad. There were 4 right here, with more of their squad back here having recently cleared buildings, one jumping over these knocked over garbage cans beside this car, and another following right behind him, with more following them. This squad, broke in half, who was dismounted from one of their WZ-551s, was busy clearing the adjacent streets, much like was shown in the pictures going on up here, similar to that. So this would have been occurring within this area here. Having already engaged and eliminated armed civilians here, more armed civilians, even a few guardsmen intermingled within them, running across the street. As the Americans had lost all command and control, they also lost the ability to act on any actionable intel and could only engage what was immediately in their vicinity or within earshot or within view. And command and control had totally broken down. So these American National Guardsmen either led or became part of the now resisting armed American civilian forces within the town itself. As within this building, fire was being taken from this window, so they lit up that window already, and they're firing at these men trying to cross here. Also, in the north of the town, where these buildings were being cleared, these homes, there were a few homes where not just regular civilians, but like your refugee classes or soon-to-be refugees, but also were hiding small groupings of armed civilians, such as in this home where a People's Armed Police stack team or half of a squad that broke off to clear a house was moving through the house quickly and fully knowing that there were 2 armed civilians in this room. They threw a grenade into the room to clear the room. The point man of this particular stack team stepped off to the side slightly and threw a hand grenade into the room, where you can see it's an armed civilian back here charging his rifle after just loading a mag in, and this was heard by these men out in the hall. And of course, you have another one standing with his back pressed against the wall right by the door here, as you can see the rifle and the foot. And they threw in their hand grenade to take out the 2 in the room. They often responded with measures like these, as the PAP was very brutal and would, as the term goes, kill a fly with a sledgehammer. They were armed with the quintessential QBZ 95 assault rifles, which themselves were a bullpup design, meaning that the action was at the rear of the rifle where the magazine weld was located, with the trigger mech actually in front of that. So they, like the PLA and the regular military, were given the 5.8 by 42 millimeter QBZ 95 rifles, with the PLA getting also the newest rifle, which fired the same caliber, the QBZ 03s. But the PAP was also given this caliber, with other paramilitary elements getting the older rifles, as China had in total 20 million paramilitary forces to arm and equip, often meaning that the third-tier paramilitary forces, and not the more first-tier forces like the PAP of the paramilitary, first and second tier rather, they would get the older Type 56 rifles or the Type 81 rifles in many cases, which were older designs that fired 7.62 by 39 millimeter cartridges, as many millions of those rifles had been produced by China. In fact, the Type 56 was the most widely produced version of the AK-47 in existence, and is an old rifle but still effective and given to the third-tier units as their standard issue weapons, while the newest weaponry was always given to the PLA, of course, but also to the PAP paramilitary forces in terms of small arms. Although there were assets within the PAP that were given older weapons, for the most part their standard issue weapons were the same as their PLA counterparts. In the southwest of the town, right as the PAP troops crossed the borders, the light tank and also some of the mechanized infantry forces up here can be seen in this outermost part of town, advancing into the town. But this was a bit further off the map before they broke off and headed to the north, and they broke off and took the center and south, respectively. A mix of guardsmen and armed civilians can be seen here trying to resist. As you can see in the background, the town by this point is mostly completely been shelled by 122mm artillery and has either caught fire in some instances due to the crossfire involved or due to the previous artillery strike igniting certain flammables in some cases, such as even vehicles that had a lot of fumes in their gas tanks at the time they were hit, causing nearby buildings to catch fire, and other such things. There were intermingled by this point dismounted National Guardsmen from their original vehicles trying to assist the armed civilians in this area to resist the onslaught of the PAP Mechanized Infantry Battalion's forces, as shown here and here, and also to the slight south, on another street, the PAP's lead light tanks of one of their light tank companies. Here, quickly, was a tripod-mounted tow system mounted on this armed civilian's ATV that was rolled into the area, and a rope tied around the trigger mech and helped to be aimed by this armed civilian working together with the guardsmen, and thereby fired at and destroyed this armor personnel carrier, eliminating its crew as well as the dismounts that were still inside of it. As in total, by the end of this battle, due to the urban fighting and the nature of it, as well as due to the PAP having to engage so many different guerrilla elements, even with all the advantages and even within a small town, had suffered some casualties due to the combination of their wanting to proceed as fast as possible in tandem with their brutality, sometimes even becoming distracted by firing at unarmed civilians, and this caused very small windows for the defenders to get certain locks on their targets and thereby enabled them to destroy a few. One based off of this man-portable tow system, destroying an APC. Another based off of a tow fired from one of the two pods on a Bradley that was shortly thereafter destroyed in turn. And two other light tanks would be destroyed by a well-prepared ambush on the outer edges of the town itself by armed civilians who were able to hide and hold still in tall grasses as their targets approached them and Molotov them, as the Molotovs are hastily put together using gas tanks and wine bottles and other empty bottles. Although not everybody had Molotovs, of course, as these had to be made and put together, there was at least 5 to 10 minutes by which quick-thinking civilians who actually had the implements available right in front of them to even be able to do such a thing did manage to put some together within that short amount of time. While the defenders did everything they could to try to slow down the invaders, the battering ram of the PAP forces was simply too much, and they couldn't be stopped. See a wheeled WZ-551 with a 25mm autocannon impacting right in front of this destroyed house, this outer wall, blasting and eliminating this guy here and others on the outside of the picture. Light tank Type 62G firing its main gun. Its coax is 105mm rifled main gun. Its coax and its turret machine gun are firing. There's one behind it coming down the street. It's part of this company and its column of 20 light tanks and, of course, headquarters vehicles further back, where it was a bit safer as they were lighter vehicles and needed to support the logistical operations of the combat forces. First 3 vehicles coming into view of the WZ-551 armor personnel carrier versions with their turret machine gunners. Infantry fighting vehicle WZ-551 right here. Dismounted Chi-Com PAP infantry forces. Destroyed building. Rubble of it. armed civilians, guardsmen, deceased, armed civilian, guardsman, deceased guardsman. Lots going on. And this, just to the southeast of town, just off the map, was the lead elements of one PAP Light Tank Company. As you can see in the background, Q5 had just dropped ordnance in town further back where close air support had been called in. It is now flying up after its attack run. Here's the town, the very edges of it. There's farm and ranches out here. Blast from a strike from this Q5, who dropped its ordnance back here to hit a grouping of armed civilians before flying up in the air, orbiting the area, and being called in for close air support alongside of this tank company, firing its 23mm autocannons almost danger close to the armored forces, but this due to the close proximity of the armed civilian forces trying to get in their Molotov attacks, as again, the only reason they even had a chance at destroying the enemy vehicles with Molotovs is because they were able to hide and wait and get in close enough, while the ISR assets missed them by monitoring areas where other heavier activities were going on to relay targeting to the aircraft and CH-901 drones on their AI piloting systems, as so this one about to come down and hit another grouping of armed civilians. As they were monitoring, all these ISR assets were monitoring so many aspects of the battlefield and areas where actual heavy combat was occurring, or areas where it was about to. Certain very small groupings of civilians did, if they stayed still enough, managed to crawl slowly, get into position, and lay in wait while the quadcopter recon drones of these different tank platoons flew overhead and ahead of the tanks to recon the area to check for any sort of enemy activity. Although these drones did have infrared and they did have night vision capabilities, the fact that there were so much smoke throughout the battlefield and fires going on and other activities often meant that as the drone operators were hastily moving the drone and sweeping areas ahead of the tanks, other forces could sometimes come in and get close enough and wait, like hiding under abandoned, destroyed vehicles or hiding amid other types of foliage, like perhaps a pine or mesquite area or scrub brush that would somewhat obscure their IR signatures. While this was occurring, heavy combat was breaking out everywhere. And as these leading tanks got close, Molotovs were vigorously tossed at them, although the tank turret gunners responded to their sides, wiping out those who threw the Molotovs, although the vehicles did catch fire and they had to abandon their vehicles, with the drivers even on fire as Molotovs had hit closer to the driver's hatch. The flaming liquid seeped in and caught their clothing on fire as well, so they abandoned and had to roll on the ground just to put out the flames in some cases. The strafing Q5s came in and destroyed other parts of these armed civilian clusters while this was going on. So all in all, the combat in this area was exceedingly savage. Of course, artillery continued to be called in wherever could hit within its range throughout this whole battle, not just in the Dolores town itself, but within the whole battle, because other areas of the battle were seeing combat in their own respective zones, as the whole 5th Medium Brigade rushed into this sector, splitting in half between half of its forces going just for Dolores, with the other rest of their forces splitting into two other prongs of 2 battalions apiece, heading in a more southern direction, while the 7th PAP Regular Brigade, its light, basically mechanized infantry forces that were typical of PAP elements, were coming down from the north from CCP properties as they were a Trojan unit, and their objective was to try to cut off any sort of escape for mostly the 1st of the 41st Infantry Regiment, but also to engage any type of armed civilian elements within their sector as so. This would only occur by hour number 4 that they would reach the area as they were coming down from closer to Eagle Pass, which is a bit further away and off the map. This entire duration of the battle inside and immediately around Dolores lasted for 3 hours due to not just the nature of the combat itself, but also because the PAP wanted to thoroughly clear the town of any and all of its population. And the rest of that will be left to the imagination. Because before this battle even happened, civilians of Mexico that were inside America had already been given warning to flee by their consulate, although the consulate kept the exact message to a very broad statement saying that it was due to rising international tensions. Much of the Mexican population who was living and working in the area by this point heeded the advice and indeed left and went home right across the border. This because Mexico, being the staging area for the Sino-Russian coalition, and as far as in the south for most of its southern-based invasion prongs, was treated as a friendly nation to the Sino-Russian coalition, and therefore its civilians were not to be targeted as far as directly, and were given the opportunity to leave America before the invasion initiated and kicked off, and they were given the opportunity to go home, as the consulate sent this warning out to all their civilians, not just via phone before the cyber attack occurred, but also letters to where people were staying at. Again, the message, the nature of the message itself was very broad and left to the imagination, but it implied that due to rising international tensions between America, China, Russia, and other nations, that it would be absolutely for the best and necessary for all civilians of Mexico to immediately return home. And this message was given approximately a week before the hostilities initiated. So they were given relatively short time to leave and to make the decision to leave. As the CCP and its allies told the Mexican regime to put this message out, and it was for their civilians, their population's own well-being, that they heed the message. And indeed, many of them did. The nature of the combat was so savage, as were atrocities committed by elements like the PAP against the native population, that the Mexicans that went home were glad that they did. The larger CH-4A drone circling the area, itself an armed recon drone in higher altitude circling the area, had already fired its air-to-ground based munitions at civilian targets, firing off all 6 of its HJ-10 air-to-ground missile systems at civilian trucks, pickup trucks especially, in the area that were seen to be hosting armed civilians, essentially technicals, if you will. But the drone remained airborne in order to continue to relay vitally needed battlefield intel back to the People's Armed Police paramilitary troops operating in this specific area on the ground, making rapid headway inside the nation. Even as the combat at Dolores was wrapping up, by the very beginning of the third hour of the whole invasion, as from 0 hour to hour number 3 was 3 hours, from 12 to 1, 1 to 2, and 2 to 3 a.m. Other things were occurring simultaneously, such as the other 4 battalions, a support battalion to support the southernmost prongs of attack. This support battalion going with 1 mechanized infantry battalion that was tasked out with assaulting this grouping of armed civilian ranchers and farmers that were heavily armed as far as civilian forces, along with a grouping of approximately another 340, 350 odd American border paramilitary forces at several border security paramilitary installations that were located a bit further back from the border. As approximately 8 miles inland, there were a few motor pools, administrative buildings, and other types of locations vital to the border security and customs paramilitary agencies, respectively, that were located inland a bit further away. Not just in Dolores, but just to its south here. From hour 3 to hour number 4, the paramilitary PAP forces, the 4 battalions, its headquarters battalion, which of course had its own logistical elements, as it was a headquarters battalion, was typically also a support battalion in many ways, supported these 3 combat battalions that took Dolores and cleared it. The other support battalion, specifically just a support battalion, would be tasked out to support these prongs, because as the absolute southernmost prong of 2 battalions advanced to the south, it would then link up with the other battalion and the support battalion a bit later in order to help it replenish its supplies before continuing on its most important mission of all in this area, which was to clear the area adjacent to I-35 itself, near Penitas, or near Ranchas Penitas, and clear its sector of I-35, just as Group Armies 7 through 13, the main invasion prong itself, was to be traveling up this highway. But that would not be for several more hours, as the fighting going on in the battle space just to the south was literally occurring at the same time as this battle. The 2 battles might as well have been the same exact battle, although they were happening in 2 different battle spaces, but 2 battle spaces that were completely adjacent to one another. As in, this battle here was in direct support to the larger battle occurring just to the south, as this battle in relative terms was a lot smaller, to say the least, than was the battle occurring in the Loredo city and immediate surrounding area just to the south of this part of Webb County. This once lonely corner of Webb County, Texas, having a much smaller population, of course, than the rest of the county where Loredo was further south, had only just begun, of course, to see some dynamic population growth, mostly due to the issues with the immigration as well as business bringing labor into the area as the town was beginning to be revitalized, as well as American security paramilitary forces beefing up their presence and moving in their families. But all of that work to build up this locality was all laid waste as the PAP brutally crushed the area, as just this one segment of the larger town map, this one 2x2 mile segment, has shown. Wrapping up the battle, as these forces were ambushed in the industrial area, as speaking of the battalions belonging, or the companies that comprised the battalion doing the southernmost cordon of the town, its 4 tank companies and its 3 armored infantry companies mutually supporting one another to cordon the whole south of the town, splitting up like so in long vehicle columns and supporting each other. The fighting in this particular area of the town was a bit more savage, as the Americans had better places to hide within due to the industrial sites offering stronger buildings made of stronger building materials, as well as a larger area with ample hiding spaces, as large industrial areas typically would have for individual human beings, thus making the clearance of the industrial park itself take 1 whole hour, just so the armored infantry dismounts of the PAP could peel off and clear the industrial buildings bit by bit. And to thoroughly do so would take 1 hour, while their vehicles would wait outside with their gunner, commander, and driver to be able to support the dismounted armored infantry forces should they require assistance. Ambushes, of course, like shown, were set up on the outer edges of town. And due to the amount of different hiding places, being that this edge of town was essentially a mixture of different types of nature as well as buildings, that was the only thing that made it possible for such ambushes to even be carried out, even in spite of the fact that the PAP had overwhelming ISR superiority, as they shared the same exact ISR capabilities and systems that their brother agency of the PLA, the regular Chinese military, also possessed. But to completely clear the town of 1,400 defenders and, of course, additional unarmed civilians, many of whom would be brutally slaughtered, while the rest were taken away as slave laborers, this battle would still take 3 total hours to complete, as the PAP wanted to be extremely thorough with this smaller to medium-sized town and its immediate surrounding area of approximately total 15,000 people. As the mechanized infantry forces themselves pressed on in the far northern parts of the town, in this area, upon having cleared these neighborhoods, after having smashed them by airstrikes and also clearing the edges of town where there were new homes being built, as well as also older ranches just between the Rio and the town limits, the outer parts of the town's line, just to the north of 255, that bisected the town from north and south. The fighting here was just as savage in many ways, although it wrapped up much faster than did the fighting in the industrial park, as in the north, these homes were rapidly cleared by the dismounted PAP Mechanized Infantry forces, these dismounted squads from their respective mechanized infantry companies moving through the area of their battalion, while other companies of theirs cordoned the outermost parts of the town for the rest of their mechanized infantry forces to clear the northern part, while the one whole armored battalion cleared the southern part, with another going completely around to cordon the outer part of town. It was an overwhelming attacking force of some 3,000 attacking troops between the 3 combat battalions, 4,000 if counting the headquarters over the entire 5th PAP Medium Brigade, but the 3,000 combat troops that flooded and surrounded the town were up against a force that was just under half their size, although the civilians and now dismounted without any command and control National Guard forces and whatever remained of the paramilitary forces fought a guerrilla type of campaign just in the immediate outer parts of the town and in the industrial park. In the north, such efforts were generally smaller and were stymied by less activity, meaning that firepower could be concentrated quicker and even more effectively than it already was in the south on whatever forces were trying to hold the northern parts of the town as it related to the defenders. Due to the defenders in this area trying to set up ambushes and there being less of them, they were even more rapidly spotted and destroyed. And thus, as the mechanized infantry forces and armored forces of one whole tank battalion that was coming up from the south to cordon the town from the south, as shown, linked up at 255, where it bisected the town on its eastern edge, the whole north of it had been cleared, just as had occurred in the south by the third hour into the invasion, as the commerce center was quickly flooded by light tanks and armored infantry troops and light infantry, or standard PAP infantry, essentially, of their WZ-551 APC and IFV versions after having dispatched all enemy defenders in the area. Thereby had the battle for the town of Dolores itself come to an end by hour number 3 into the invasion, with more to follow, as occurring simultaneously again to Dolores itself. The fighting there was also the fighting in ranch lands and rural countryside just to the south of the town itself.